Hello again, everyone. This is once again your old history professor, and this is the second part of Lecture 21, Early Christianity, for History 231, Ancient Mediterranean World. And we have been talking about early Christianity, the Christianity that develops in the Roman Empire, during the early Roman Empire, and that eventually Constantine is going to make legal here. But there's a lot to it before that happens that we want to discuss here. And what I'd like to do now is talk just a little bit about Christian scholarship. And this is an interesting thing because successful religions that really do make it, one of the things they tend to have in common is a strong tradition of scholarship, of learning. They appeal to people who like to study and learn, who ask the really interesting and tough questions that life brings up for all of us. And they ask these questions and they struggle with these questions in the context of their faith. And Christianity is no exception. It's one of the most brilliant things about Christianity is the amazing scholarship that Christianity has produced over the many, many years. So let's talk a little bit about early Christian scholarship. The first thing to keep in mind is that in the early years, Christianity was illegal. Like I say, you could literally be killed for being a Christian. I mean, this is no joke. This was a serious, serious thing. But in this environment, there were Christian scholars, and one of the neat things about it, one of the important things about it, is these Christian scholars would give Christians an answer to pagan philosophers who basically took a look at Christianity and said, "Whoa, that's stupid. People rising from the dead? Please, come on." And then they throw a whole lot of logic and philosophy at you. And if you're a Christian and you don't have any way to answer that, you're not going to feel so good, right? So early Christianity also had scholars who could come back and answer these kinds of critiques. And that's really going to be very, very important. There's a couple of ones. Clement is one example, but the one that I really want to talk about is our friend Origen. All right, Origen. And good old Origen gets himself a star. Now, this guy is a very interesting sort of character. A very interesting sort of character here. Now, the biggest threat to Christianity was actually not the snooty pagan philosophers, but another philosophical tradition called Gnosticism. Gnosticism stresses wisdom and knowledge. You become initiated into Gnosticism here. And what the Gnostics tend to do is they take elements of other people's religions and they mix them all together. They put them all together and reinterpret them. And that's, of course, what people always do with religion. The Gnostics, however, were very, very good at it here, right? And so this is an interesting thing because they might change the story, flip it around a little bit. So normally the tradition is that the serpent is bad because he tempts Adam and Eve. But then the Gnostics say, well, is it so bad? Because after all, this is how they got smart, by eating that fruit. So maybe the serpent's a good guy. This is the kind of question that Gnostics would ask here. This is the kind of questions they would ask. All right. And again, the pagan philosophers, come on. Silly. That's the way they saw it. They just saw it as silly here, all right? And that is going to be very interesting. But Origen is a very interesting guy, and I want to talk now about our friend Origen because he is a really interesting early Christian intellectual. He was born to Christian parents, and he witnessed his own father being martyred. That is to say, his father was killed by the Romans for being a Christian. He saw this happen. Imagine for a moment if you saw one of your parents being killed simply because of their religion. This is what this guy observed. This is guy, he witnessed this here, all right? He believed in celibacy. He really believed in celibacy here. Yes, sex, he says, is a gift from God, but it is also, not something you should just run around doing it. Now, it is true that some Christians at the time were saying, sex is just bad, 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 bad. And you will always find these people. There are always people out there who will tell you that sex is bad, 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 right? And this is because sex is really kind of funky, right? It overwhelms your brain, maybe for a short time, but it does overwhelm your brain. It does change your thinking. It does affect you this way. And some people in this time were saying, when you have sex, you are possessed. You are possessed. And it's easy to see why, because, of course, this is what happens, in a way, during sex. That's the whole point of sex, right? Is that loss of control. And that scares some people, right? And so early Christians, some of them said, no, this is demonic possession. And Origen said, no, it's not that. Okay, yes, it does overwhelm you. Yes, it's not something we should run around advertising and make a big deal out of, but let's get real about this here, all right? Let's get real about this. As long as you're making babies about it with it, it's okay, is what he said. All right. Now this is interesting because Origen had some other ideas that are really quite fascinating. He believed that God has absolute power. God has absolute power. But if you have absolute power, he said, if you have this absolute power, if you're omnipotent, that means you have an infinite ability to forgive as well. So it's not just infinite power, it's infinite forgiveness, he said. Even Satan, he says, even Satan can be forgiven. Satan chose to reject God, but he too can be forgiven. God's love, God's forgiveness can overcome even that, he says here. He says hell is temporary. All right, it's sort of like a timeout with your kid. Okay, go sit in the corner until you calm down. Something some parents do. I'm not a parent, so I can't really tell you if that works. But anyway, this is the idea here. Hell is a temporary place. You send people to just sort of settle them down. It's not eternal damnation. It's not eternal suffering. It's a temporary kind of thing here. Because, he said, if you're an absolutely powerful God, how is it you cannot have an infinite amount of forgiveness? And that's a really good question. This is not a little question, it's a big question. It's a very, very interesting and very good question here. And this gives him an incredibly optimistic view of God. His view of God is a very positive view of God. And a lot of people said, I think this guy's got a point. Right? This guy's onto something here. Gregory of Nazianzus, all right, said this is the greatest mind in Christian history. The Christian historian Eusebius, who we're going to meet later, says this guy is an amazing guy, central part of the church, he says. All right. Even a guy named Jerome, and Jerome is about as pessimistic a guy as you'll ever meet. He's kind of a downer of a dude. He calls him an immortal genius here. He calls him an immortal genius. So Origen's a really interesting guy. Now, he fell into hard times. His legacy fell into hard times later. The positiveness didn't last. Other Christian thinkers were more negative, and they don't like Origen here. All right? Now, another interesting thing about Origen that is very important is he didn't look at the Bible and say you have to read this thing literally. This is an interesting thing because you find this today. You find people say, okay, the sacred book, whatever it happens to be, needs to be read literally. All right? Literally. Which runs into problems because, of course, in the first few pages of the Bible winds up contradicting itself, right? The order of creation in Genesis 1 is different than Genesis 2 and 3. It just is. How do you deal with that? Well, if you take the thing as a literal, factual document, you get yourself a problem. It's going to be a struggle. And there are people who build, these huge logical constructs to try and get around it, but the text says what it says. Here's what our friend Origen says. He says, listen, it's not a question of a problem. It's not a problem, he says, because you're not supposed to read this book literally, he says. You're not supposed to read this literally. It is a document that is supposed to be interpreted. You're supposed to interpret the Bible, not read it literally here, all right? And so what he does, of course, is he takes the various Greek versions of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament here, and he starts putting them all together here, all right? He also preferred the Hebrew, okay? Now, I like Hebrew because I've studied Hebrew, and Hebrew is really cool, so I'm very sympathetic to our friend Origen. He's one of the few guys, Origen is, from this time, one of the very few Christians who actually could read Hebrew. And this is something important. If you're looking at the Hebrew Bible and you can't read Hebrew, you're relying on translations, and translations are not always correct. They are interpretations themselves. I know this because I've done some translating. All right, I've done some translating, and that's just the reality of it. So this is an interesting thing. So, Origen says you're supposed to read this text allegorically, not literally. All right, literal is fine if that works, but you're not supposed to be expected to only do this here. All right. And he says we have to understand the mythical side, the irrational side of all this as well. These kinds of truths, he says, do not have to be factual. They are still eternal. They are still moral. Remember, fact-based meaning is different from meaningful-based meaning. There is a difference between the two. What the text means and whether it's factual are not always going to be the same thing. And that means Origen doesn't have to worry if all his texts agree in every one of their particulars, which is something that literalists get themselves into trouble with even today. So this is something for us to keep in mind here. All right? This is going to be very important. And so, for example, he says, do you take the Gospel of John, which has Jesus cleansing the temple of Jerusalem earlier than the other Gospel accounts? They don't agree about this? Is this a problem? Not for him. This is not for him. All right, so this is not a problem for him. Now, this is another interesting thing, of course, is he believes that God exists on a plane far above the human one. He's way up there somewhere. He's way, way up there somewhere. And this shows the importance of Plato, the Greek philosopher Plato. Now, I'll make this very, very clear. Do not ever think Plato was a Christian. He lived well before Christ, and he's never a Christian. He is a Greek pagan, but he's a philosopher. And he had all these interesting ideas here, and Origen and others picked up on these ideas here, all right? The notion of true, pure spirit is a very Platonic sort of notion here. The central idea of the goodness of God and this kind of thing here. Now, Origen believed that the human soul was capable of moving towards God. You were not stuck. You could move towards God and goodness, and you could do it with reason. You could think your way through this. Free will and reason, he said, can be used here. And this is going to be a big deal. And it's also something that later Christians are going to start rejecting. So that's an interesting kind of thing as well here. All right. He's perfectly willing to use pagans. He has no problem using pagans. If someone has a good idea, they can be a pagan, and he doesn't care. He'll use the idea. And that's a valuable lesson, right? A good idea is a good idea no matter who says it. You may not like the guy who says it, but if the idea is good, use it. Right, use the idea, and that's a valuable lesson for it as well. So this is an interesting kind of thing. So we find, for example, the physician Galen. For example, he says, okay, physician Galen says that the human body is in a constant state of growth and change, which, by the way, it is. All right, and therefore the resurrection could not be taken at face value. He says the resurrection was not a face value physical event, and that's interesting for him to say that. All right, that's interesting for him to say that. Now, what do the Romans think of this? Well, they're not happy. The Romans were not pleased about this. The Romans said, these Christians, they're not Jewish. And that's a problem. Because the Romans were very concerned that you might be disloyal to the emperor. You might be disloyal to the empire. You might be a problem. And what are you going to do about a problem? Well, if you're the Romans, here's what you do about a problem. You kick it in the face. The Romans were a very direct bunch, and they said, if you're a problem, we're going to take you down. We're going to take you down hard. This is what we do. All right, this is what we do. And we have to keep in mind that the early Christians are going to be heavily persecuted by the Romans for precisely this reason. All right, and it's not as though the Romans were singling them out per se. Anyone they thought was disloyal was going to take a kick in the teeth. That was the way the Romans were. All right. As early as 64 AD, the Emperor Nero, not the nicest guy in the world, all right, used the Christians as scapegoats when there was a big fire in Rome, all right? When there was a big fire in Rome, I said, oh, it's the Christians' fault, blame them. They were an easy target here, okay? They were Easterners, they were weirdos, strange people. We don't know what they're up to. They have these strange rituals. We don't know what's going on here, blah, 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 blah. And this is an interesting thing. Now, keep in mind that early Christianity had two wings. There were the conservatives and there were the liberals. And our friend Paul is one of the liberals. The conservatives, they disappear. The liberals are the ones that last here. They were pretty much destroyed. The conservatives were after 70 AD with the Jewish rebellion and so forth. But other Christians would spread. They would go into Asia Minor. They would get into other places here. And you see a lot of persecution as a result. And thousands of Christians were killed. This was not a little thing. This was not, okay, well, I didn't like that one guy. No, this was thousands and thousands of people here. Why? Why would the Romans do this? Well, there was this notion of legal religion in the Roman world. Legal religion. Right? Legal religion. New religions, they didn't like new religions. The Romans felt new religions might be cause for sedition. They might be cause for disloyalty to the Roman state. There was also an idea in the Roman world that the Christians were atheists, which today sounds really crazy. Right? But they were, okay, wait a minute. They don't worship the Roman gods, so they're not really religious. They don't believe in the gods. They're atheists here. They're atheists. And you know what? What if, just what if, Jupiter's really up there with a big lightning bolt and he's about to drop it on you if you don't do what he wants? Do we really want to tick this guy off? Do we really want to make him mad by having these Christians run around saying he's not real? We can't afford this. So in other words, many Romans felt the Christians were putting them at risk for punishment by the gods. And so they said, we've got to do something about this. We've got to do something about this. It's also true that the early Christians frequently told the other Romans that their ideas were not that good. all right, that maybe their ideas were kind of silly and maybe a little stupid. Nobody likes being told their ideas are stupid. Let me give you some advice. If you ever want to convince somebody of a new idea, do not tell them that their old ideas are stupid, because that is a guaranteed way to get them to dig in their heels, harden their hearts to it, and then you're never going to change their mind. All right? You cannot change people's minds by telling them they're a bunch of idiots. All right? And this is a problem. All right? People felt the Christians were belittling their way of life, and that did not make them any friends. All right? Did not make them any friends. So the Jews, well, they've been around a long time, and the big rebellions, and they've got this one God thing. We're going to let that slide, the Romans say. But not the Christians. Not the Christians here. Because those Christians are just weird. Besides, and here's another thing the Romans did say about them, and this is kind of weird. Okay, they said, those Christians, I hear they eat their Savior. Doesn't that make them cannibals? Aren't those Christians cannibals? I don't know anything about them. I don't know any Christians. I just hear about them, down in the sewers. Are they eating people down there? They eat their Savior. What's going on with that? So this is something we got to keep in mind here. The early Christians, if you don't know a Christian, it's easy to start saying they're weirdos. Right? And this is true today. All right? A lot of people who say, oh, well, gee whiz, I don't really like Muslims. Muslims scare me. Muslims are weird, blah, 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 blah. And you say, well, you ever talk to a Muslim? You ever go to the Middle East, maybe visit a mosque, sit down and chat with them a little bit? Well, no. Well, then how do you know Muslims are bad? Now, I've been to the Middle East. I've been to a lot of places in the Middle East. I got to tell you, all the Muslims I met over there were really nice. I really liked these people. And the more of them I met, the more I liked them. And the more I liked them, the more I start thinking, their faith is pretty cool. If you don't know any Christians and you're a Roman, it's the same thing. It's real easy to come up with all sorts of crazy, wacky ideas about those weird Christian people in the sewers if you never met a Christian. And so this is something we got to keep in mind about the early Christians. They were regarded as separatists and weird, all right? And weird. And of course, that means they were persecuted, and they were brutally persecuted. It was horrible what the Romans did to the early Christians. It really, really was. The worst of the persecutions, interestingly enough, happened in the 3rd and 4th centuries at exactly the time the Roman Empire is having the most trouble. And as I say, that is not a coincidence. I really don't think that's a coincidence. When any society feels stressed, people start acting crazy. And right now we have this terrible coronavirus, and I'm looking around and I'm thinking, are we going to start seeing Americans and people all over the planet act weird and crazy because of this thing? Because we're all stressed, we're all scared. And if you're scared, your common sense starts to go away. And that's something we got to be on the lookout for in our own time. And it's not just the coronavirus, it's any time. It's any time. It's very easy to start looking at other people, different people who look differently, who act differently from you, and saying, oh my gosh, I think they may be the reason that this horrible virus is running around. Well, that's just ridiculous. The virus is a little microbe, and it gets into people's bodies, and some of those people, it messes them up. And that's really it, all right? And we're trying to stop it, and hopefully we will, because it's a pretty nasty thing. But to run around saying, oh, this group or this person or that person must be responsible, that's just not going to work. That doesn't work. Epidemiologists will agree with me on this. That doesn't work. So, the same thing's happening here. All right? As long as the Christians are weirdos, we can persecute them. And as things get rough in the 3rd and 4th centuries in Rome, the persecutions get worse too. The Romans start getting really, really nasty. Horribly unpleasant things were done to these people. The Romans had a huge sadistic side to their culture. We've talked about that. They had a very sadistic side, and if they thought you were a problem, they would take it out on you pretty hard. And that raises another interesting question, the issue of martyrdom. And this is a really important point. Martyrdom is when you die for your faith, or your belief, or whatever it happens to be. Now, this is not the same. I want to make this clear. This is not the same as being a suicide bomber. A suicide bomber is a murderer. That's a different thing. If you die for your faith, you can be a martyr. If you kill for your faith, you are a murderer. And there's a difference between the two things. What the early Christians had was what we would call them martyrs, because here's the thing. The Romans would round them up, and the Romans would say, okay, you better make a little sacrifice to the emperor, and if you don't, we're going to feed you to the lions in front of a big crowd. And they would do this. We're going to light you on fire. We're going to do horrible, horrible things to you because that's what we do. All right, this was martyrdom, and a lot of early Christians were martyred, right, in very, very unpleasant ways. And this is really kind of interesting, because did this in fact weaken Christianity? No. It strengthened Christianity. If the Romans had wanted to stop Christianity, the best thing they could have done was ignore it. But they didn't. They went after it, and it did not work. And when you persecute people, it almost never works. And that's a valuable lesson we can take from this, from our Roman friends. So this is a very interesting kind of thing, as we have seen here. All right. Next time, I'm going to talk about how Christianity goes from being this minority, persecuted little group of people literally worshiping in the sewers to people in big cathedrals with power and money and wealth and a whole new kind of Christianity. And that is because Constantine changes the game. And after Constantine changes the game, he changes it again and again. And then people after him start changing it. And Christianity, after Constantine, is never going to be the same again. It is going to be something very different. And that is an interesting story for next time.